Calvin Holt lived alone on a wide stretch of dry land in northern Arizona. The sun burned the earth every day, and the wind carried dust across his ranch like an endless whisper. He had been living there for years, tending to his cattle, mending fences and talking only to his old dog, Rusty. People in the nearby town called him the Silent Rancher. No one could remember the last time they heard him speak more than a few words. Calvin wasn't born quiet. Once he was a man who laughed loudly, told stories at the local diner, and loved his wife more than anything in the world. Her name was Mary, and she was the light of his life. But one night years ago, a violent storm swept across the desert. Mary was driving home with their unborn child when the rain made the dirt road slick. Her truck skidded and rolled into a ravine. Calvin reached her too late. That night broke something deep inside him. After that, words felt useless. He sold off most of his land, moved farther from town, and built a fence not just around his property but around his heart. His days followed a quiet rhythm. At sunrise, he would feed the horses, check the water troughs, and repair whatever the wind or time had damaged overnight. He didn't keep a clock anymore. The sun was enough. Rusty followed him everywhere, limping slightly but loyal as ever. The old dog seemed to understand the silence that wrapped around the ranch like a blanket. Sometimes Calvin would sit on his porch in the evenings, staring at the horizon where the sky met the red cliffs. He would remember Mary's laughter, how she used to hum while hanging laundry, and how she always talked about helping people on the nearby reservation. Those memories still hurt, so he tried not to think about them for too long. The desert, he thought, was easier than people. It never asked questions and never reminded him of what he'd lost. One afternoon, the air grew heavy and strange. The wind stopped and the smell of rain drifted in from the west. Clouds built up quickly, dark and tall, swallowing the blue sky. Calvin was out near the far fence line, tightening wire, when he noticed something odd in the distance. At first it looked like shadows moving across the sand. Then he realized they were people, 3 figures walking slowly, leaning on each other. He frowned, wiping sweat from his brow. Nobody ever came this way, especially on foot. As the figures came closer, he saw that they were women, wrapped in long blankets, stumbling like they hadn't eaten or drunk water in days. Rusty started barking, running in small, anxious circles near the porch. Calvin froze for a moment. He hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks, and now 3 strangers were heading straight toward his door. He took a few steps forward, unsure whether to wave or call out. Before he could decide, the first woman fell to her knees, then another, and then the third. They collapsed right in front of his porch, their faces pale and lips cracked. Calvin's heart jumped. Whatever his fears were, they no longer mattered. He ran forward, shouting for Rusty to stay back. He knelt beside the women. They were breathing, but weakly. He saw deep sunburns on their faces and hands, their shoes torn from walking on rough ground. He didn't know who they were, but he knew they wouldn't survive long without help. Carefully, he lifted the first woman into his arms and carried her inside his small cabin. She was light as a child. Then he brought in the other 2, laying them on the floor near the old wood stove. Calvin moved quickly, his hands remembering what his mind had forgotten: how to care, how to act without thinking. He filled cups with cool water from the clay jug and helped them sip slowly. He boiled water on the stove, tore old sheets into strips, and cleaned their cuts with gentle hands. He gave them bread and beans, small bites at a time. As he worked, his heart pounded with a strange mix of worry and purpose. It had been years since anyone needed him. The cabin, usually silent except for the creak of wood and the ticking of the lantern, now echoed with soft groans and the sound of shallow breathing. After a while, the oldest of the 3 women opened her eyes. Her voice was faint, dry like the desert wind. She whispered one word: "Help." Calvin nodded, unable to answer right away. He hadn't heard another person speak inside this house since Mary died. He took a deep breath, swallowed hard, and said quietly, "You're safe here." His own voice startled him. It sounded rusty, like an old gate being opened for the first time in years. The woman gave a weak nod and drifted back into sleep. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. Calvin stepped onto the porch to watch the sky. The first drops of rain hit the dust, turning it dark. He could smell the wet earth and feel the coolness spreading through the air. For a moment he stood still, thinking about what had just happened. 3 women, Apache from the look of their clothes, had somehow found their way to his lonely ranch. Why? When the storm passed, he went back inside to check on them. The women were sleeping deeply, their breathing steadier now. Rusty lay nearby, keeping watch. Calvin sat by the stove, staring at the faint glow of the embers. His hands were trembling slightly. It wasn't fear, it was something else, something he hadn't felt in years. The night stretched on. He barely slept, listening to the sound of rain tapping against the roof. Every so often he would check their blankets, make sure they had water, and adjust the fire. He noticed one of them had a necklace made of small turquoise stones. Another clutched a small woven pouch like something sacred. They must have come a long way, he thought. Near midnight, the oldest woman stirred again. Calvin offered her water, and she took it with shaking hands. She whispered something he couldn't understand, a word from her own language. Then she looked at him with tired eyes and managed to say in broken English, "Walk many miles. Need help?" Calvin nodded again, speaking softly. "Rest now. You're safe." She smiled faintly before closing her eyes. When dawn came, a soft golden light filled the cabin. The storm had cleared, leaving the desert fresh and alive. Calvin stepped outside to feed the animals. The air smelled clean and the sky was bright. He looked toward the horizon, where the dirt road disappeared into the distance. Everything seemed normal again, except for the faint trail of footprints that led to his porch. He couldn't stop thinking about them. Who were they running from or walking toward? Why had they been alone in the desert? As he poured feed into the trough, something caught his eye. Far off, beyond the ridge near his barn, he saw thin lines of smoke. Small campfires glowing faintly in the early light. Someone was out there, a cold feeling ran through him. Maybe the women had been traveling with others. Maybe those people were still out there, searching. Or maybe they weren't the kind of people who brought safety. He stood there for a long time, staring at the distant ridge, unsure what to do next. Inside the cabin, the sound of quiet breathing reminded him that he wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in years, his world had changed. The silence that had filled his days was broken by the soft human rhythm of life. As the morning sun rose higher, Calvin sat on the porch steps, his hands folded together. Rusty leaned against his leg. The desert stretched endlessly before him, but now it felt different. Not just empty land, but a place where fate had brought 3 strangers to his door. He didn't know what the next day would bring. But deep inside, a small spark had begun to glow again. The same spark that once made him laugh, care, and speak freely. And though he didn't realize it yet, that day marked the beginning of his return to the world, and the start of a story that would change not only his life, but the lives of the 3 women he had silently promised to protect. The morning sun spread a soft light across the desert hills, and Calvin woke to the sound of gentle voices inside his cabin. For the first time in many years, there were people there other than him and Rusty. He stood by the doorway, unsure whether to step inside or stay out. Through the open door, he saw the 3 women sitting up weakly. The oldest one was speaking quietly to the other 2 in their own language. When she noticed Calvin, she smiled faintly and said, "Thank you for helping us." Her voice was tired but kind. Calvin nodded, awkward and unsure how to respond. Words didn't come easily to him anymore. "I'm glad you're better," he said quietly, his voice still rough from disuse. The woman introduced herself as Lena, and the younger ones as Nina and Tala. They explained that they were from a small Apache community about 50 miles east. They had been traveling to town to find medicine for a sick child when their old truck broke down in the middle of the desert. They tried to walk the rest of the way but ran out of food and water. The heat had nearly taken their lives before they reached his ranch. Calvin listened carefully, nodding now and then. The more he listened, the more he realized how close they had been to death. He quietly thanked God that he had been home that day. "You saved us," Lena said, looking at him with honest eyes. Calvin shook his head slightly. "Just did what anyone would do," he muttered. But deep down, he knew not everyone would have done it. Many ranchers lived alone in that desert, and most avoided visitors, especially strangers. For Calvin, who hadn't spoken much to anyone in years, helping them had opened something in him that he didn't fully understand. The women stayed for a few days to recover. Calvin fixed them meals, beans, bread, and stew, and gave them clean blankets. Each day they grew stronger, and little by little they filled his silent cabin with life. Nina hummed soft songs while she cooked. Tala laughed with Rusty, who had taken a liking to her. Even Lena smiled often, though her eyes still carried worry. One afternoon, while the women sat outside in the sunlight, Calvin joined them with mugs of coffee. He hadn't sat and shared a moment like that in years. Lena looked at him curiously and asked, "You live here all alone?" "Yes," he replied simply. "Your family?" she asked. Calvin paused for a long time before answering. "Gone," he said. His voice was low, but his eyes were far away. Lena nodded slowly. She didn't ask for more details, and he appreciated that. There was a kind of understanding in her silence, one that didn't need words. Later that day, Lena told him about her community. She spoke of their struggles, how their small reservation had been running out of clean water, how the children often got sick, and how hard it was to find medicine or transport. "We came for help," she said softly. "We have to go back soon. A little boy there is very sick." "We can't stay long," Calvin thought for a moment. "My truck still runs," he said slowly. "I can take you back." The women looked at each other with surprise. "You would do that?" Lena asked. He nodded. "You need to get home," he said simply. That night, Calvin checked the truck for the first time in months. He changed the oil, filled the tank, and tightened the old belts. Rusty sat nearby, watching with curious eyes. The desert wind had cooled, and the stars glittered above them like silver dust. Calvin felt strangely alive. Helping these women had given him a reason to move again, a purpose beyond his grief. The next morning, just as the sun rose, they loaded the truck with a few supplies, water, bread, and blankets. Lena sat in the front beside Calvin, while Nina and Tala sat in the back with Rusty. The old engine roared to life, coughing up a cloud of dust, and they began their journey. The road was rough, winding through rocky hills and dry plains. Sometimes they passed empty stretches where only tumbleweeds moved. Other times they saw the bones of old vehicles half buried in sand. The desert could be cruel, but Calvin drove steadily, keeping his eyes ahead. After hours of driving, dark clouds began to gather again. The same storm that had passed days earlier had left swollen rivers and muddy paths. When they reached a shallow crossing, Calvin stopped. The water was running fast, but they had no other way around. Lena looked at him nervously. "It's deep," she said. Calvin studied it for a while. "We'll take it slow," he said. He shifted gears and pressed gently on the gas. The truck entered the water, rocking as waves splashed against its tires. Nina and Tala held onto the sides, and Rusty barked loudly from the back. Halfway across, the truck started to slide, the wheels spinning in the mud. Calvin gritted his teeth. "Hold on!" he shouted. He turned the steering wheel sharply and pressed down harder. The tires caught a patch of gravel, and with a loud groan, the truck pushed forward, climbing up the far bank. Everyone cheered with relief. Once they were safe, Lena laughed and said, "You drive like a man who isn't afraid of anything." Calvin smiled faintly. "I'm afraid of plenty," he said. "I just don't let it stop me anymore." Hours later, they reached the small Apache village. It was a quiet place surrounded by low hills and red dust. Wooden houses stood in a circle, smoke rising from their chimneys. People came out as the truck rolled in, surprised to see it. When they recognized Lena and the others, they rushed forward, calling their names. A woman led them straight to a small hut, where a child lay on a blanket. The boy's skin was pale, and he was burning with fever. His mother knelt beside him, tears in her eyes. Lena explained quickly what had happened. Calvin didn't waste time. He fetched water and wet cloths to cool the child's forehead. He remembered how Mary used to treat fevers with patience and gentle care. For hours, they worked together, Calvin, Lena, and the mother, until the boy's breathing became steadier. When a nurse from town arrived later that evening, she checked the boy and smiled. "He'll be fine now," she said. The entire village sighed with relief. Lena turned to Calvin, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You saved another life today," she said. Calvin shook his head again, but this time he smiled softly. "Maybe we all did," he replied. As the sun set, the villagers invited him to stay for supper. They shared food, stories, and laughter around a fire. Calvin listened quietly, feeling warmth inside his chest that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the fire, it was the company, the life, the connection he thought he had lost forever. Before they parted, Lena handed him a folded blanket made of colorful threads. "For you," she said, "to remind you that silence can end and hearts can heal." He accepted it gently, not trusting his voice to speak. The next morning, Calvin drove back to his ranch. The desert stretched wide and calm again, but something inside him had changed. When he reached home, he hung the blanket on the wall near the window. Its bright colors filled the room with life. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch. The silence was still there, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful, like a friend instead of a burden. He thought about Lena, Nina, and Tala, the women who had come out of nowhere, and reminded him that there was still kindness in the world, and still a reason to speak. Days later, Calvin hitched up his truck again. This time he loaded supplies, food, water, medicine, and drove back toward the reservation. When he arrived, the children ran to greet him, and Lena smiled from a distance. The man who had once avoided every voice now talked easily with people, telling them stories, fixing fences, helping wherever he could. The name Silent Rancher no longer fit him. The desert hadn't changed, but Calvin had. He had found his voice again, not through words alone, but through compassion, courage, and the unexpected kindness of 3 strangers who had collapsed at his door one lonely afternoon.